3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about Phase 14, the revolution that changed the world. So going back about 200 years ago, the colonization of the world by European empires had greatly expanded, and European monarchies essentially ruled the world. At the same time, however, the increase of intellectual thought in Europe began to pose issues to these European monarchies because people began to question the idea of being ruled by a monarchy, with the idea that they deserved better. As mentioned in the last episode of the podcast, an intellectual revolution was beginning to form just before this time, inspiring people to think more and more about government and its role in society. And as a result, a newly formed desire for freedom began to emerge in North America. So this takes us to the British colonies in North America, and these colonies were initially formed about 400 years ago, and at the time were given a fair amount of independence to mostly rule themselves with their own government on the continent, as long as they remained loyal to the British monarchy. Over time, though, the British monarchy began to regulate the North American colonies' independence more and more, giving colonists less and less control over their colonial affairs. And this was done in order to help the monarchy in its competition against other European monarchies. And so this started out with the British monarchy regulating colonial trade, which naturally caused some tension with the colonies and the empire because it would hurt the colonial economy. And by about 200 years ago, this tension became overwhelming. After the French and Indian War, which was a war between the British and the French empires battling for territory in North America. And in order to pay off the costs of the war that the British monarchy would eventually win, the colonial government economies became more and more under the control of the monarchy, and the monarchy also started taxing the colonies more to pay off those costs from the war. In response to this, the colonists started to protest in the streets, declaring the new taxes unfair, and challenged the British monarchy's authority to create new laws in colonial North America. And for the British monarchy, this was shocking, because you have these colonists acting as if the authority of the most powerful monarchy in the world doesn't apply to them. And so in response, the British monarchy set out to show their authority over these colonies by creating even more strict laws to enforce taxation, as well as adding additional taxes on top of those taxes that already existed. These new laws were known collectively as the Townshend Acts, and basically gave the British monarchy complete authority over the colonies, along with the right to suspend colonial governments that disobeyed with any laws made by the British monarchy. From here, the outrage amongst the colonies just continued to grow due to these new rules and restrictions. And this was especially true in the very rebellious Massachusetts colony, where anti-British sentiment was very, very influential and strong. And you start to have incidents developing between colonists and British soldiers. For example, in 1770, you have a case where British soldiers end up shooting at protesters. And in 1774, you have another case where colonists in Massachusetts dump a bunch of British tea in the ocean to protest the tea tax by the monarchy. And in response to this, the British monarchy passed one more major law called the Intolerable Acts, which among many things replaced the government of colonial Massachusetts with one appointed by the monarchy. And also, the British military was given more power to control all the different colonies. You see, from the perspective of the British monarchy, they felt things were getting out of control and hoped that they could make an example out of the rebellious Massachusetts by punishing that colony. However, though it was ultimately directed at Massachusetts, all the other colonies were punished as well to a certain extent. And in turn, rather than alienating Massachusetts and making all the colonies become fearful of the British monarchy, and in fact did the opposite, and it rallied the colonies to unite together. And a couple months later, the colonies formed what would become the Continental Congress, which was a colonial government where representatives of all the different British colonies of North America came together to discuss the new laws imposed on them by the British, and as a result, they came up with a statement listing their rights as colonies, which included life, freedom, property, the ability to assemble to make decisions, and a fair trial by jury. They also rejected being taxed without proper government representation. They then sent this to the British government demanding that these things be fixed, and until it was fixed, they would reject all British goods sent to the colonies and refuse to send any colonial goods to the rest of the British Empire. And at this point, the tension between the British monarchy and the British colonies of North America was really starting to build up to the point where it was getting impossible to control. And the British monarchy would ignore this petition, and 1 year later, in 1775, this tension would eventually just explode. Because at this point, the British felt things had reached a critical point, and they needed to prevent any future military uprising in the colonies. So naturally, they decided that they needed to confiscate the military supplies of the very rebellious Massachusetts colony. And on their way to do this, to their surprise, they were met by armed colonial resistance. So here, in this moment, and what would become known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first battle of the Revolutionary War, you have this very dramatic event where you have these colonists, which are just everyday people like you and me, just normal people standing face to face with the most powerful military force in the world, the British Army. Then all of a sudden, one unknown person fires a shot. And with that shot, the American Revolution officially began, and this shot would go down in history as the shot heard around the world. The colonists would miraculously win this battle, and the future President George Washington would be named the commander of the United Colonies military force, and later the United Colonial Government, the Continental Congress, led by another future president, Thomas Jefferson, would create the Declaration of Independence, declaring the United Colonies independent from the British monarchy. And by 1778, after important victories against the British, the French Empire would actually join the fight as well, helping the Americans eventually win the war in 1783. The French were more than happy to help the Americans due to their recent loss in the French and Indian War, as mentioned earlier. And due to the French help, the United States of America officially became a nation of the world. But the most important aspect to this story is what happens actually after the Revolution, because the United States of America went on to create one of the most influential documents in human history, the United States Constitution, which would go on to serve the modern world as a guide to creating a free and democratic society, promoting the following values: the separation of government powers, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom to protest, the freedom to participate in a state-based military force, also known as a militia, to prevent government oppression, and the freedom to a fair trial by jury. This is the oldest constitution still in use and the foundation of modern democracy. Therefore, because it remains in use, it is still a living and breathing document, and one which continues to be updated over time to promote a more fair society. For example, amendments have been made throughout history in order to fix societal issues of the past. For example, to ban slavery, to allow voting rights to women and minorities, to stop discrimination, despite the fact that those subjects were not in the Constitution stating that slavery is allowed or that you should discriminate against people, but it was in the minds of the people of that society. Thus, the document serves as a reminder that as time changes, our understanding of freedom and democracy and what those constitutional ideas truly mean change as well. We are not, as human beings, the creators of a perfect society, but throughout our history, we continue to grow and become better. Because deep down, no matter all the bad things we see or hear on the news, there are always more people trying to make this world better than not, much like the writers of the U.S. Constitution did. And though in the future our flaws will be obvious to those who look back on us and judge us, but they will see, by looking at our historical context, they will see our progress as hope for theirs. Thus, at the end of the day, this is our world to make better. So as always, remember, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.